Good evening. I'm Faye Jensen, the CEO of the South Carolina Historical Society. As many of you know, it's the goal of our organization to tell the story of the state and nation and to engage young and old in the lessons from our past. I think that tonight's talk falls in line nicely with this year's topics, as we just had 4 winter lectures that focused on the colonial period. Before we get started, I'd like to ask Scott Stevens to say a few words about our organization. Scott?
Thank you, Faye. Hi, everyone. As Faye mentioned, my name is Scott Stevens, and I'm the Vice President of Development with the South Carolina Historical Society. The South Carolina Historical Society has over 2 million items in its archives and is the best organization in South Carolina to be affiliated with if you want to research a period of South Carolina history. In addition, the Fireproof Building, designed by Robert Mills in 1827, is the home of the Historical Society Museum, and we'd love for you to visit whenever you're in Charleston. It's because of you that we're able to expand, preserve, and make accessible this wonderful collection of South Carolina's history. I want to encourage you to go to the South Carolina Historical Society website at schistory.org and find all the ways that you can join us as we share South Carolina's rich history with the world. Thanks for being here, and I look forward to seeing you at the museum in the coming months.
Thank you, Scott. Now, for those of you in attendance, I want to remind you that you'll be muted throughout the webinar. We do hope to have time for questions, so please type those in the chat box and I'll read them out to our speaker when he's through. So now I'm delighted to welcome Stuart McLaurin, who is the president of the White House Historical Association. If you don't know about that organization, I encourage you to visit their website. I've long been a fan of their beautiful Christmas ornaments, but I was really impressed when I went on their website to see about the other things they've been doing, and their educational outreach and programs are really superior. And Stuart has done tremendous things in those areas. In addition, he recently authored a terrific book about James Hoban that we'll hear about tonight. Prior to his work with the White House Historical Association, Stuart held senior positions with George Washington's Mount Vernon Estate, the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation, the Motion Pictures Association, Georgetown University, the American Red Cross, and the federal government. He's a graduate of the University of Alabama, where he majored in both political science and history. Please join me in welcoming Stuart McLaurin.
Well, thank you, Faye, for that very kind introduction, and thanks for all that you and Scott and your colleagues do at the South Carolina Historical Society. What an important part of teaching American history there in South Carolina. We look forward to partnering with you on many other things. And to our friends watching us virtually tonight, although we have to be together virtually, I do look forward to the opportunity to visit Charleston and to see the historic places there that were important to James Hoban. So it's an honor for me to be with you today to share with you the history of the People's House, the White House, and how it was built by a diverse group of enslaved and free laborers, European artisans, and others convened in and around what we now know today as Lafayette Park. Telling these rich stories of White House history has been the mission of the White House Historical Association since we were founded in 1961 by First Lady Jacqueline Kennedy. It was Mrs. Kennedy's vision to create an organization to provide non-taxpayer funding to maintain the museum standard of the House, which had been largely neglected through the presidents leading up to the Kennedys. Well, of course, the government cared for the infrastructure, but congressional funding was generally not available for the interiors, design, and decoration of the White House, and for acquiring art and furnishings for the White House collection. In fact, first families wanting new furniture throughout American history often had to sell the old things with little regard for the historic significance of what was being discarded. It is said that First Lady Mary Todd Lincoln sold White House items to raise funds after the president's assassination left her nearly destitute. Amazing story of President Chester Arthur, who auctioned off, believe it or not, 24 wagon loads of furniture in 1882. Objects like cutlery and presidential china had a way of disappearing or breaking over time at state dinners and other occasions. So by the time of the Kennedys, the house was a collection literally of things ranging from department store furnishings and hand-me-downs and remnants from various presidents. So to address her vision of the very best of America, Mrs. Kennedy set about to create our organization, the White House Historical Association. And she approached the types of people who provide the private resources and funding to organizations like the South Carolina Historical Society and great American museums around the country. And we owe a debt of gratitude to Mrs. Kennedy today that the White House now has its own curator and curatorial staff. That didn't exist before the Kennedys. Now the furnishings and appointments are exactly to that museum standard that Mrs. Kennedy envisioned, and that's to be the very best of America. In fact, in no small part to the work of the White House Historical Association, in 1988, the American Association of Museums actually accredited the White House as a museum. Well, Mrs. Kennedy also had a heart and vision for education. She first visited the White House as a young teenager with her mother, and she was really disappointed that there was no guidebook like you get when you go to any museum today. So the first order of business with us when we were founded was the publication of the first White House guidebook. We're now in the 25th edition of that book, and it led to a rich history of educational programs, online and in person, as well as the publication of many books over the years, and our quarterly magazine, which is actually my favorite publication. But tonight we're going to talk about our most recent publication, and it's this a wonderful book that our publications team worked with me to produce, James Hoban, Designer and Builder of the White House. And it's that story that we're going to talk about this evening. Well, let's go back to 1790. Congress is passed the Residence Act with the strong backing of President George Washington, that the location of the national capital, which had been a contentious issue between the northern and southern states, being first located in New York City and then Philadelphia, President Washington actually sought a capital on the Potomac and to centralize state debts in the federal government as well. Both of these things were achieved through this Resident Act. Now, it gave the president 10 years to develop a new national capital from the 10 square miles procured from the states of Virginia and Maryland along the Potomac River. We now know the legacy name of this plot of land to be Washington, D.C., but it was initially referred to as the Federal City. To begin the work of this new national capital, a group of commissioners was created to oversee the project. You've likely heard the story of Pierre L'Enfant, the French architect, who laid out the general grid and plans for the Federal City, but you may not have heard the name or may be as familiar with James Hoban, the young Irish carpenter and wheelwright who evolved his skills in Charleston, South Carolina, and he became what we would today call an architect. Hoban came to the United States in the 1780s. He was still in his 30s at the time, a relatively young man. He had been trained under the great supervision of Thomas Ivory in Dublin, the great architect there, and studied at the Dublin Society School of Architectural Design. He then found himself coming to America in this great southern city of charm and growth, Charleston, and it was there that he connected with Pierce Purcell. Now, Purcell was an established local carpenter, and many believe that Purcell may have actually been a cousin of Hoban's from Ireland. But Hoban lived in Charleston with the Purcells at what was then 43 Trott Street, later Whitworth Street. And Hoban built a house next door that he later sold in 1798 when he decided to stay in the federal city of Washington and not return to South Carolina. So it was in Charleston that together Purcell and Hoban were founders of the St. Mary's Catholic Church, and they were also founding members of the Masonic Lodge in Charleston. It's believed that they worked together on many buildings in Charleston, perhaps even the rebuilding of the colonial era state house that had been burned, and of course, quickly was to be rebuilt with hopes of keeping the state capitol in Charleston. Well, actually, President Washington met Hoban in Charleston in 1791 on a Southern tour. And a year later, when Washington was focusing on who would actually build the presidential house, his mind recalled seeing the buildings in Charleston that Hoban had been responsible for, buildings inspired by those great Irish houses, those Irish country houses, and Leinster House, which is now the home to the Irish Parliament in Dublin. And I have to tell you that when I visited Ireland and I walked up on the facade of Leinster House, this great facade of this beautiful building, it was clear and apparent to me that it had to be the inspiration for the White House. It looked that much like it. There are other places in Dublin which I had the privilege to visit, such as the old Newcomen Bank, now a government office building. And I walked in and there are these amazing oval rooms in that space. And you can imagine how, to me, they were hauntingly reminiscent of our oval rooms in the main residence of the White House today. And although the Oval Office itself is a creation of the 20th century, the diplomatic reception rooms, like you see on your screen now, the Blue Room and the Yellow Oval Room, are reminiscent of those oval spaces in the old Newcomen Bank building in Dublin. Well, in selecting Hoban as the architect, I have to believe that George Washington's thumb was on the scale. Many competed in this open contest to be the architect or to be selected, including our friend Thomas Jefferson. But it was James Hoban who was selected by Washington and engaged with the commissioners to set about to assemble the team of craftsmen, artisans, and laborers who would build the president's house. Now, Washington himself selected the exact site and orientation of the plot of land and the cornerstone that was laid on October 13th, 1792. And as I look out my window across Lafayette Park tonight, I can see the White House just there about 150 yards from where I sit this evening. It was built in what we know as Lafayette Park today, which is right outside my window here. There was a carpenter shed there, which was the central point of activity for all of the workers, the hub for all the workers who lived and actually worked in this community around the park. There were enslaved workers that we know who were rented out by their owners to be part of this project. In fact, I'm very pleased to say that the White House Historical Association, our historians, have spent the past 4 years doing a significant amount of research on the role of these enslaved workers, not only in the White House, in building the White House, but it's incredible to me to realize through this research that enslaved persons to 9 of the first 12 American presidents lived and worked in the White House. Well, this mission and this focus really came to our attention very strongly in the summer of 2016, when then First Lady Michelle Obama gave a commencement address at the City College of New York. And then later that summer, the speech at the Democratic National Convention in Philadelphia. And you may recall hearing her say that every day she wakes up in a house that was built by slaves. Well, you can imagine our website and our phone lines were inundated with requests for more information, for the story behind that story. And it virtually crashed our website on that occasion. So at that point, our Slavery in the President's Neighborhood initiative began. To date, we've identified over 300 individuals by name or part of names that were actually involved with building this historic People's House and worked in the White House for our early presidents. Well, these workers were all involved in every aspect of the building, and including the gathering of the stone for this wonderful president's home. Most of the stone for the White House was acquired from the Aquia Quarry about 30 miles south of Washington down the Potomac River. And it was acquired by enslaved and free workers who carved this stone out of the ground. You can actually see this picture of me in the Aquia stone yard today. You can still go there. It's a county park in Stafford County, Virginia. And as you drive up or down I-95 between Richmond and Washington, you've likely seen the exit for Aquia. And it's quite a wonderful stroll to step back in time. And I encourage you, if you're making that trek, to stop and do so. It's really a wonderful step back in history. Well, the markings actually remain on those stone in that quarry that are the signs of the stone cutters and the craftsmen that work to move that stone, cropping. You can, in your mind's eye, picture them cropping that stone out of the ground. They labored to drag it down to the shore of the Potomac, and they actually had to pole it 30 miles upstream and offload it on the shore of the city here. And from there, it was taken over to the Workyard, what's now Lafayette Park, to build the White House. Well, we also know the story of the 7 Scottish stonemasons who came over from Scotland. And although they were actually forbidden by British law at that time, due to the war between Britain and France and the belief that their works would be needed there for that endeavor, they had been laboring on homes in Newtown and Edinburgh, and that had come to a halt. So they actually risked coming to our country illegally for this work. I've been to Edinburgh, and I've actually seen where they signed out from their Masonic lodge and wrote a very poignant note, essentially, gone to America, hope to be back. You can still go there and read that today, and it's really a fascinating record. Well, they came to this federal city in America, and they quickly set about to work with James Hoban to carve the intricacies that still adorn the White House today. Just 4 years ago, we made a very interesting discovery. Our senior historian at the time, Dr. William Seal, discovered these same carvings of a rose-like flower on the pilasters and columns all around the White House, above the north door of the White House. And in his research, he discovered that this was called the double Scottish rose. It turned out to be very popular in Scotland in the late 1700s, and later became popular throughout Britain in the Victorian era. It was known to be a Scottish mark of pride and a symbol of Scottish immigration to the New World. And therefore, we believe that the Scottish stonemasons put it there, I like to say, as a Scots wink of history in leaving that double Scottish rose around the White House. Well, the stonemasons were very gifted in their craft, and the sandstone from Aquia, Virginia, was very similar to the stone that they would have used in Scotland. Perhaps had it been determined that the White House would instead have been built by a marble or a harder stone, then maybe artisans from Italy that were more familiar with that type of carving would have been called. But it wasn't that. It was the same type of soft sandstone, a type of porish stone that was deployed. And it was the Scottish stonemasons who were brought over, and their mark, their carvings, their intricacy remains part of that design today. Well, just a few years ago at our annual symposium, we had the opportunity to work with the Historic Environment Scotland organization to fly over a current stonemason in Scotland, and he actually carved a life-size version of a double Scottish rose from a piece of stone that we were able to get from Aquia as a demonstration project for our supporters and friends here gathered here in Washington. And it was so interesting to watch him work using these modern tools that they would not have had in the 1790s when they would have had to use much more primitive and difficult tools to achieve the same beautiful image. Well, interestingly enough, as the White House that we know it today was being built, life around the park had various dimensions of livelihood and community. One of those that I think it's important to share with you this evening is faith and faith life. We do know James Hoban was Roman Catholic, and we do know that workers of the Catholic faith worshiped in that carpenter shed, as did Presbyterians, likely our Scottish stonemason friends. In fact, Hoban was the builder, as a Roman Catholic, of the first church of any denomination in Washington outside of Georgetown. Now, the Jesuits had built Holy Trinity Church in Georgetown, but that was a little too far for practicing Catholics to go from Lafayette Park, what we call it today, to Georgetown. So St. Patrick's Catholic Church was built by Hoban, And the successor to the initial building remains today just a few blocks from the White House. They actually have this wonderful plaque there, and you'll see it in the book, that commemorates Hoban not only as the builder of the White House, but also the builder of the first St. Patrick's Church in Washington. And of course, I have to say the National Presbyterian Church in Northwest Washington traces their roots back to those who worshiped in the carpenter shed right here in the park as well. Another aspect of Mason's life, or of Hoban's life, is being a Mason, as was George Washington. We think perhaps that their connectivity as Masons and having that in common was important in their relationship and their ability to communicate on how best to design and build this house and what they envisioned for that. We do know that Washington believed that stone houses, which were popular in Europe at that time, but not so common in America, Washington believed that stone houses would be respected by the leaders of Europe. He knew Hoban's training in Ireland and what that would produce, and what he saw of Hoban's work in Charleston thought this would equip him well for this type of work. So Washington wanted a great stone house, but then there was another side to that, the caution that was expressed by our friend Thomas Jefferson, perhaps others of the founding fathers as well, that our president's house should not be a palace. It was common for monarchs in European capitals because, as you know, the president is not a monarch, it's a citizen entrusted with the temporary executive authority that our Constitution provides be equally balanced against the judiciary and legislative branches of government. So while Jefferson sought a much more modest house, given his anti-federalist positions, George Washington wanted something more prominent to demand respect or command respect for the office of the president from both Europeans and from Americans in this new country. Well, fast forward, and the end result was James Hoban's, which I believe struck the right balance between both visions. Hoban's design was large by the standards of the time, at the time for American homes, but it would be considered small today when contrasted to, say, a Buckingham Palace. In fact, every time I take someone through the White House, one of the first things they say or comment on is how small the house feels to them. But it's this building, this White House that we call today, that has stood the test of time for 229 years since the cornerstone was laid in 1792. And it's that house, that small white house, that remains the symbol of American freedom and democracy to the world today. So although George Washington selected the site of land, he was the only president of all our presidents that actually didn't live in the White House. It wasn't until John and Abigail Adams moved into the White House as its first occupants in November of 1800 that we had a president residing in the executive residence. But then, as you all know, in August of 1814, the British advanced on the city of Washington. Ironically, those British troops were led by an Irishman in the British military, and they set fire first to the Capitol, then they advanced on the White House, and the White House was charred to its core, leaving much of the walled structure in ruins. In fact, today, as the White House is stripped of its paint from time to time and repainted, you can see these scorch marks, but there is a place that is always left unpainted where you can see the scars from that day of the fire, that horrific day in American history. Well, after the fire, Hoban rejoined the cause to rebuild the White House that was directed by President James Madison. Madison said, we're going to rebuild it. We're not going to move it. We're not going to relocate it. We're not going to build it bigger or more fortified. We're going to rebuild it. And that was done in 3 years' time for occupation by President James Monroe in 1817. Hoban was also called upon by Monroe a little later, and then Andrew Jackson, to build the north and south porticos on the White House, which are very familiar to us today, but would not have been common for our earliest presidents. The White House then evolved throughout the years in little things here and there until the turn of the 20th century, when President Theodore Roosevelt actually undertook a significant renovation of the White House interiors. It is actually also under Roosevelt that the executive mansion became officially known as the White House. It had been referenced in the media as the White House, but it wasn't until Teddy Roosevelt put those words on the White House stationery that it became known officially as the White House. Up until that time, there was the main building of the house, which served as the home to the president and his family. It was also the office to the president and his staff. As it is today, it was the ceremonial stage to receive the most important visitors to our country and from across the country, and also to receive, as it is today, thousands of visitors who were just touring the White House. But Roosevelt had a large family, and they were all up on that third floor residence. And Mrs. Roosevelt said, no, this will not do. So Roosevelt built a building to the west of the White House, which is commonly referred to today as the West Wing. Roosevelt's staff offices were moved to that building, and today that's where the Oval Office is and the president and his staff work. Well, all went well with just minor modifications and patching until the presidency of Harry Truman. Well, of course, Harry Truman becomes president unexpectedly with the passing of FDR. And this is the end of World War II, end of the Great Depression. And it was during those times that the nation was greatly stressed on its resources. Would not have been proper for a large amount of attention or financial resources to have been placed on the restoration or rebuilding of the White House. But that all changed in Truman's mind when the compelling cause came home to him, when he would see that anyone walking on the third floor residence floor would cause those great Bohemian Roosevelt era chandeliers in the East Wing to sway. And you can imagine if one of those came crashing down on a dignitary or a visiting head of state or guest of the president and the first lady. It really came home to President Truman, where one evening his daughter Margaret was playing her piano on the residence level. The leg of the piano went through the floor and into the ceiling below. So Truman quickly realized that in order to save the White House, he and his family had to move out, which was quite a sacrificial thing for any president to move out of the house for over 3 years. So in 1948, President Truman, Bess, and Margaret moved across the street, across Pennsylvania Avenue, to the Blair House, which is still the president's guest house today, a house that had been acquired by the Roosevelts and became the president's guest house, and we still use it for that purpose today. So major restoration and renovation work was done to the White House at that time. As you can see from this startling image, the entire interior of the White House was gutted. Steel infrastructure was put in place of the wooden timbers that had been there since the rebuild after the British fire, and it was completely rebuilt out. But during this time, it's very important to recall that Truman wanted the exterior walls to remain intact. The veneer of the White House demonstrated to Truman a strength and stability, and it showed the White House was still there, still represented American freedom and democracy to the world. So the work of that major Truman restoration from 1948 to 1952 really remains the foundation of the structural integrity of the White House today. Well, so we have the story that thanks to the efforts of many of our presidents and the work they've put into the White House, the work of James Hoban is known around the world by the 3 words, the White House. James Hoban, his own name is not known, but those 3 words are virtually universally known around the world. His legacy is the 229-year-old house, which is 229 years is a very short period of time in world history standards, but it's a long time in the measure of American house history. And the People's House, which has been the home to American presidents and first families ever since the Adams. So it's really through the work of the White House Historical Association that we're honored and privileged to have this role. And it's through the publishing of our book on James Hoban, designer of building the White House, and our book on the stonemasons, which is called The White House of Stone. And I might mention that you can get both of these books on our website, whitehousehistory.org. But it's through these books and others that we continue to tell these important stories and that we preserve the important legacy of people like George Washington and James Hoban and every president and those who worked with them and for them over the years. And we preserve this legacy in our nation's history for future generations. Well, I'm very proud to say that 2021 happens to be the 60th anniversary of the White House Historical Association. We're the living legacy of First Lady Jacqueline Kennedy's vision. And I hope that you will follow us on our social media channels, explore our website, which is rich with content and material. We have an extraordinary digital library, which is available to scholars, students, authors, journalists, others seeking to learn more and to use more visual resources of the White House. And I hope you participate in our digital offerings and our programming as well. I'm a great believer in partnerships, and it's such an honor to partner with Faye and her colleagues at the South Carolina Historical Society and to tell the story of a James Hoban. This is a man who got his beginning, took his roots in the great state of South Carolina, and brought that additional skill and training to our federal city and built the White House, which I've said before this evening is the symbol of American freedom and democracy to the world. So Faye, with that, I'd be happy to take as many questions as we have time for.
Okay, let's see what we have here. Looks like we're getting ramped up, those. If you all will put your questions in the chat box, I'll read them out. I had one. How were the Scottish stonemasons recruited? Did Hoban do that?
Well, there was actually another gentleman by the name of Colin Williamson, who was a Scot that worked alongside Hoban early in the project. And Hoban, there's actually a piece of this story that I've not solved. And we knew Hoban preferred the Irish stonemasons, but Colin Williamson prevailed and went and identified the 7 stonemasons in Scotland, recruited them, and had them come by ship over to commit to this work. So I don't know if it's actually that the Scots committed and came earlier than the Irish, but it was the Scots that took on that specific work. Now they were known to have somewhat of an attitude in the work community. They were professional and craftsmen and artisans that had come from Scotland. And so they didn't really blend or mix well with the Irish laborers or the other laborers, but their mission was very specific. Now, we do know that a few of them returned to Scotland. Some of them stayed here in the United States. We recently had the opportunity to go to Edinburgh and put a plaque on 2 houses on Queen Street where these Scottish stonemasons worked and built those houses once they returned to Edinburgh from their time in the United States. So it's wonderful to be walking down Queen Street. You see this plaque with a picture of the White House on it, talking about these stonemasons who returned and did work there.
That's neat. That's neat. We have, let's see, now we're getting some questions here. Let me go up here. Someone asked, when was the landscaping begun around the White House?
Well, the landscaping, of course, came after. If you watch David McCullough's wonderful series on John Adams, the Adams arrive in November of 18, and it's muddy, sloshy land going from their carriage up to the White House. And remember, Washington is built largely on a swamp area. Down beneath the Federal Mall today is the Tiber Creek still runs. And so this was a swampy, marshy place. You know how humid and hot Washington is in the summer anyway. And so it wasn't really a desirable plot of land. So it took some time before gardening and landscape actually took root. Thomas Jefferson had a great interest in this. He was credited with building the first fence around the White House, which was a wooden fence, not a wooden fence today. But then John Quincy Adams and others, we have records of their interest in plantings. And after each presidency, the National Park Service, still to this day, after each presidency, creates a beautiful large document that identifies every single plant and tree and shrub it's on the site of the White House to memorialize the gardening and the work that's done on the White House grounds. Today, the National Park Service takes care of it on a day-to-day basis, and they really do a terrific job of that.
Neat. Things I never knew. Another question is, how much of the White House construction did Washington see? I know he died in 1799. Did he get to see the outside take shape?
Well, we believe that he stopped in at the executive residence at the president's house on his way back to Mount Vernon at the end of his presidency. Hoban gave himself the title of captain, and he treated his workers as if they were a militia. So the story is told of how Hoban marshaled his worker militiamen in front of General Washington, President Washington. He reviewed the militia, but remarkably, we have no record of him going into the house on that occasion, nor do we have any record of him coming back from Mount Vernon to see any part of the nearly completed house. And of course, he died and would not have visited subsequent presidents there. So it's interesting that we have a story of him stopping by, reviewing the troops, if you will, seeing the work, but not really going in that we're aware of.
That is interesting. Another question is that you mentioned items were sold in the past by presidents and as they remodeled and for other reasons. Has there been an attempt to retrieve those items?
Great question. Perfect question for our mission. It's one of the things that Mrs. Kennedy wanted to do and was very important to her. Let me give you the best example of this. As I mentioned, James Monroe comes back into the White House in 1817, having been our minister to France, first president after the British fire. He acquired a 53-piece suite of French Parisian furniture made by a French cabinet maker named Bélanger. Those 53 pieces stayed part of the White House collection until the presidency of James Buchanan. By then, it was believed they had been recovered a time or two, they were worn, and as was the custom, as I said, presidents wanted new things, not old things. So Buchanan, believe it or not, got rid of 52 of the 53 pieces of that suite of Bélanger furniture. Excuse me. Well, Mrs. Kennedy comes along and has that very thought. She wants to bring back to the White House any elements that can be retrieved that were once part of the White House collection. We've been able to retrieve 10 of those original 53 pieces. We know where 4 other pieces are, but we can't go in and claim them because they were legally dispersed. But the rest are lost to history, I'm sad to say. But we have just invested $800,000 to refurbish that suite of furniture and some replicas that we've had made. And you'll know it today by that extraordinary blue furniture that's in the Blue Room of the White House.
Oh, neat story. Another person wondered, did any of the enslaved workers belong to Georgetown University?
No, but that's an excellent question. There's been a recent project undertaken by Georgetown. I believe it was 272 slaves that were owned by the Jesuits, who were the founders of Georgetown University, that were sold to raise funds for the university. And Georgetown has undertaken a major project to identify the descendants of those, to work with them, and to build a communication. But there's no record that any of those slaves were those that worked on the White House itself. We do know that they were rented from their owners, and in the pay logs, it is often the name of the owner that's listed there rather than the name of the slave. So we've had to do layers of research to go to those owners' records and find and kind of piece things together. But there's a very compelling story about tragic and compelling story about those Georgetown University related slaves. But to our knowledge and according to our research, none of those were affiliated with the building of the White House.
Okay, good to know. Another question is there a list of the names of the stonemasons?
Yes, if the book, A White House of Stone, which I mentioned, is our book on this. If you go to our website, you can order that book. We also have articles on our website that I'm pretty sure list the names. Those names are known specifically, and there's pretty good records of their goings and comings. But those are available on our website, and definitely through the book, A White House of Stone.
Okay. And then I don't know if you would know this or not, but someone asked, did any of the stonemasons go to Charleston afterwards?
We're not aware of that. We are aware of some who set up shop here in Washington. You can imagine how the city took off after the Capitol and the White House were underway. So there was quite a compelling need for their work. In fact, there were a few of them that went back and worked on the White House itself, 1814 to 1817, when the White House was rebuilt after the fire. But I'm not aware of any that made their way to Charleston.
Okay, and another Charleston question. I should know the answer to this. You said the street he lived on, or he built his home on, is now called Wentworth. Is the house he built still there? I'm embarrassed.
I don't believe so. I believe that house was long ago razed and is no longer there.
Other than the Scottish rose, are there other possible clues or Easter eggs that the builders left their signature?
Well, one of the things I love about my job is I could work here the rest of my life and not know all there is to know about White House history. So although we're an education organization, I learn too something new every day. And so I'm sure there are things that we have not yet discovered. As I said, it was just 4 years ago that this double Scottish rose, that connectivity was made. There's one thing that I would love to find, and that's the cornerstone that was laid for the White House. We had a recent conversation. In fact, I had a podcast that was released yesterday, our 1600 Sessions podcast, which I'd love for all of you to listen to. But I did a podcast released yesterday with the Federal Masonic Lodge here in Washington about the history of the Freemasons and the White House. And I posed the question to them, what happened to that cornerstone? It's never been found. Our records are that it's never been found. Truman, who was a Mason, alluded to it, but there are no records of it actually being located or found during that time of the Truman renovation. It was customary to put a time capsule in these cornerstones. So that's one secret I would love to find the answer to one day is where is that cornerstone and what was left in that time capsule?
Old buildings always have fun little clues like that. And I can imagine that one has more than most. This question says, is there a Benjamin Benneker story connected to the construction of the White House or to Hoban?
I don't know that. I'll take that one on referral.
Okay.
I'd have to get back with you on that one. But, if you want to reach out to me, my email address is on our website. Reach out if you think of a question after this that you'd like to pose to me, including that one. If I can't answer it, I'll get one of our historians to. I love history and studied history in school. In fact, this picture behind me here is my 5th grade class trip to Washington, D.C., sitting out on the Capitol lawn. And so I love learning about these things, but I don't represent myself to be a historian. I'm an advocate for the American people to have access to learning and opportunities to know more about their White House. But we have a terrific team of professional historians here, and I'd be happy to deploy them against any question that I can't answer for you this evening.
That's true. You do have a great staff. And this may be better done by email too. Someone wants a referral on someone who could help them with additional information on the silver in the White House.
Great story about the silver in the White House, a great collection of White House silver. Some of it has escaped and drifted off over the years, as I referenced. We've actually done, I think we have a significant amount of research on the White House silver collection. If you would reach out to me through our website, I'd be happy to connect you. I think I know the exact person on our staff who could be helpful with that.
Wonderful. Thank you. And another one wanted to know how Hoban's end. How did he end his life?
Well, he went on and built many things in Washington, D.C. I mentioned St. Patrick's Church, St. Mary's Church in Charleston, but St. Patrick's Church here in Washington. He went on and built the first Roman Catholic seminary here in Washington, which was adjacent to St. Patrick's Church, and 2 other Catholic churches here in Washington. Unfortunately, his home where he lived over on F Street was burned. So most of his records and papers and documents were burned. So we have very little in his own hand. There are a couple of documents still available at the National Archives that belong to him, but tragically, most of his own documents were lost. So he continued to build and work. He died here in Washington, was buried in a cemetery affiliated with St. Patrick's Church, and was later moved out to Mount Olivet Cemetery, which is a Catholic cemetery in Northeast Washington. And we have the privilege and honor now of maintaining that gravesite. On St. Patrick's Day every year, we do a wreath laying. This year we did it in partnership with the DAR, the Hibernians, the Irish ambassador, and the Masons. It was a wonderful occasion. There's another sad part of this related to Hoban. This image that we have on the cover of the book comes from a very small wax portrait that was done of Hoban that is now in the White House collection. It's the only known image of James Hoban that exists. His son was said to have looked very much like him, and every now and then you'll see an image of James Hoban that is reported to be this James Hoban, but it's actually an image of his son. So another sad thing that we only have this one image of this physical being of James Hoban. You know, again, to the point I made earlier, a man in historical anonymity for large part, but the legacy, the most prominent legacy of his life's work, or perhaps 3 of the most known words in the global vocabulary today, the White House.
That's wonderful. I think we have time for one more. And this one is, you mentioned his work in Charleston and Washington. Was that where the majority of his architecture is, or are there other examples?
Very good question. We aren't certain of his point of entry. We know that there were advertisements in the Philadelphia newspapers and in the Charleston newspapers around in the late 1780s offering his work available. We're not aware of anything that he actually did in Philadelphia. So he must have gone to Charleston right away. We believe Purcell, his believed to be cousin, was there. Perhaps that was a draw for him there that set him up with work. But it's only in Charleston and in what we now know today as Washington, D.C., where we know the remnants of his work survive in this country. Now, there are buildings that we know he worked on in a more junior capacity in Ireland, and those, I mentioned some of those, the Newcomen Bank was one of those, but in the United States, only Washington, D.C. and in Charleston.
Okay, good to know. Well, Stuart, this has been just wonderful. I just enjoyed your talk so very much, and we thank you for giving us your time. We thank the White House Historical Association for your mission and for what you do. And I know everybody who's attended joins me in saying how much they appreciate you being with us tonight.
Well, thank you so much, Faye. It's my honor and privilege. And thanks to everyone who spent time with us this evening. The work that you do, Faye, the work that we do is all so important there's such a tremendous amount of historical illiteracy in our country today. And we're all needed to change that and turn that around. So thank you so much for the important work that you do as well.
Thank you so much. Good night to everyone. Have a good evening.
Good night. Thank you.
Bye-bye.